Brother Mazin Khalil. He is a Sudanese-American. He's also an activist. He's studying to become a medical doctor. Inshallah, may Allah bless him in that effort. I'm hoping that he can give us some insight on the history and background of Sudan and why this conflict is happening right now, and also why there's been so little attention to it, both in the mass media as well as within the American Muslim community. So, Brother Mazin, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the show.
Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah kulli khair, Imam, for having me here. I'm happy to
Why,
be your guest. And inshallah, I hope we can have a very fruitful conversation, bismillah.
Alhamdulillah. I mean, inshallah, we will. Now, I'm a bit, the name of the podcast is Islamic History Podcast. I love history, and I'll try not to go too deep into history and ask you too much historical questions because really we want to know what's going on right now. But just so we can a little bit to know about, get to know you a little bit better. Um, I introduced you as a Sudanese American. Were you born in the United States or born in Sudan? Where are you born and how did your family come to the United States?
Yeah. Actually, I was born in Sudan. I was born in a little village that consists of about 3,000 people. Very, very small village. So everybody knows everybody. You know, if you're running down the street and you're doing something wrong, one adult will grab you and fix you up right quick, and then you go home and you cry about it, and your parents ask you why you're crying, and they'll fix you up too right afterwards. So, that's the kind of village that I grew up in.
Okay.
Alhamdulillah. Yeah, and then we came to the US. Brooklyn, New York is where my family arrived at, and where I've lived for most of my adult life, alhamdulillah.
Is there significant Sudanese community in Brooklyn? I lived in Brooklyn for most of my childhood, really. And I bet if there was one, I didn't know about it. Is there a significant Sudanese community in Brooklyn?
Yeah, there's a pretty big Sudanese community here, alhamdulillah. In New York City in general, there's a really big one. We have two actually communities here, one in the Bronx just because it's a little far for
Yeah.
people to get down to, and then one that consists of the Brooklyn, Queens area.
Mm.
So we have about like maybe give or take about the size of my village, about 4,000 people here that are Sudanese.
Okay.
Last time I checked is about 4,000 people.
Okay. Are they concentrated in a certain part of Brooklyn, or is
So
it just spread out?
we have a masjid actually that doesn't belong to us, but that we have been going to for forever.
Mm.
And so people just call it the Sudanese masjid, even though we didn't build it. It's not ours. It's just where we all pray together, Jama'ah and all those things. But we're predominantly concentrated in Brooklyn. And then the other half of the community is concentrated up in the Bronx.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
MashaAllah. Well, your fa and coming over here, I've had discussed with really a Somali brother who he didn't come to the United States. He wound up having to immigrate to the UK after the civil war over there started. With your family, was there any sort of conflict in Sudan that had them come over, or did they just come over on their own will, just looking for more opportunity? What led
Yeah.
presumably, I guess, your father and most likely your mother, what led you to come over to the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. So where we come from in Sudan, specifically where I come from, there's really not like hospitals and like the medical system in Sudan. Although we produce really, really good doctors, we don't have a very stable medical system. Unfortunately, the infrastructure isn't there. But subhanAllah, it's very interesting because like we have very great clinicians, like amazing clinicians in Sudan, but we just don't have the resources for them to fully utilize their talents and the abilities that they have. So we actually came to the US because my mom has a heart condition, and there was no way to get it treated in Sudan. So that's the story about us coming here, and that also led me to become a physician or a student physician, alhamdulillah.
Okay. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. Now, since since you've been in the United States, have you been back and forth to Sudan frequently, or have you not really gone back that often?
Yeah, so for me it's been a little bit tough to go back. I have the first time I returned back was in 2009, and then after that again in 2014. So we came in the summer of 2000. Yeah, closer towards the beginning of 2000, and then we went back in 2009, and then in 2014 was the last time I was there. Part of that has been because it's super expensive to go to Sudan, especially with the embargo that the US has had on the country. So it makes it very difficult to find direct flights there. And then the other part of it is just I've been a student my entire life. So like I've never had like a summer or a set time where I
Okay,
can be like, okay, I can go home during this time period.
okay, I got you. All right.
Yeah.
Now, regarding your trips to Sudan, you can, what is about Sudan that you love? What is it? If you can, most of us is listening. I've never been to Sudan, and the vision or the videos or pictures we see are often not very pleasant. So if you can, what is your best memory, or what is it about Sudan that you really know it makes you love the country, or makes you miss it, or help us to get a better visual understanding of what Sudan means to you, or at least
Absolutely.
that's your
So Sudan, like generally when people mention Sudanese people, and this is not to brag or anything of that nature, we're just generally known for our kindness and our
mhm,
hospitality. And so I'll give you a story that was written actually and published in German newspapers. I don't know where the article is now, but it was published in like German newspapers and also published in English newspapers as well about this particular man who was traveling across Sudan during Ramadan. And he was traveling through the region where I was from. They were going up to the northern states in Sudan, and as they were traveling, their caravan was stopped. And the guy begins to freak out because he's like, "Oh my God, what's happening? These people are stopping us on the side of the road. What's going on?" It's Ramadan, and so the people end up actually fighting the bus driver because they're trying to get him to go to the village with them to go break fast over there. And so the people are fighting between the villages in order to be able to have and honor and give karama to this person as a guest.
mhm,
So that's generally the hospitality that we're known for. Sudanese people are generally known for that. One thing that I really, really love about us is we're very communal. It's a very communal society, alhamdulillah. And so, that's one of the things I miss, and one of the things that's so heartbreaking, looking at the news now and seeing, this going on, especially with the reputation that we have and how much we live up to that reputation.
right. Alhamdulillah. Now, now for the more difficult part to talk about. Well, first of all, of course, we all know there's a current civil war. I guess is probably the best way to call it, happening in Sudan right now. I just want to ask, how's your family doing? Your relatives over there? I'm sure you still have some over there. How are they doing? Have you experienced, or have they experienced any as much as you're comfortable with sharing? What kind
Yeah.
of danger are they in?
Yeah, Alhamdulillah. So the war broke out in Khartoum, which is the capital city of Sudan. And it forced basically people of Khartoum to flee to other parts of Sudan and to relocate. And as the war has moved across different parts of Sudan, people have had to move. So you have people who essentially have been displaced once from Khartoum now moving to other parts as well. Alhamdulillah, I have family who do live in Khartoum, but they were able to go back to where we come from, the village that we come from. Obviously, the influx of people in the villages and in these regions has made it particularly difficult for families. The average Sudanese person makes about 20 USD a month. So it has caused prices to go up, the price of goods to go up, produces and things like that. So it has become very difficult overall in the country. But alhamdulillah, my family is making do, and alhamdulillah, everybody's, just trying to do the best that they can. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah, may Allah protect them. Now, um, I won't say I first heard of Sudan, but one of the first earliest conflicts I heard, excuse me, I heard about Sudan was back in the 90s. And it was before the internet, and the whole thing was blown up as the Arab versus African thing. And there was accusations of the Arab Sudanese enslaving the Southern Sudanese who were generally African. And I know a lot of this, even I was, and I'm sure some of this probably started before you were born. And I heard about the filter of Western media, so I'm pretty sure I got a very distorted version of it. But when we heard about it, of course, for Black Americans, it's going to be very sensitive to hear of slavery. That's always a sensitive topic with us. But also the accusation of mass rape and of racially charged conflict back in the 90s. And it ultimately led to the splitting of Sudan in 2011, if I'm not mistaken, leading to the new nation of South Sudan, which I believe are having their problems as well. Uh, Regarding the accusations and the war, as much as you know about it, as much as you remember of it, first of all, were those accusations true? Was it a racially based war, a racially driven war between Northern Sudanese or Arab Sudanese and African Sudanese?
I think so. One thing that's super important to to kind of bring to the forefront is that here in the US we think of things in terms of race. In other places we think of it in terms of tribes. So we don't have racism per se in Africa, and the reason why I'm very careful with using that is because we're all black on the African continent, right? So we do have tribal conflicts. So race, what we would see here as problems of race exist in Africa, but they are problems of tribalism and they're issues of tribes as well. Now, that's not to say that racism doesn't exist, right? Because we do have lighter skinned people who are Africans looking down on darker skinned Africans. That completely exists. But at the end of the day, I think we all think of ourselves as Africans to a point. And so our problems aren't really based in race, but they're based in tribalism. And so now the issue that you're talking about is a bit of a complex one, especially for us as Sudanese, because our identity is a little bit jumbled. We have an identity crisis, and this is kind of a sore spot for us as well. And the reason why we have this identity crisis is because so Sudan, we do have Arab Sudanese. We have people who identify as Turkish. We obviously have the colorism issue that we spoke about previously on the podcast that you and I were on before. So we do have that colorism issue, and that leads people to try to self-identify as different. Although Sudan literally means land of the black, so we are all black people, you know. And so you have people who try to create this hierarchy based on different things. Okay, well, I'm not, purely African. I have Turkish blood running through me. I'm not purely African. I have Arab blood running through me. I'm not purely African. I have this kind of blood running through me. So we do have that, and that does exist within our society, unfortunately. And that does create problems. Part of the issue is actually one of British colonialism. So when the British colonized Sudan, the top part of Sudan, which would be like the area where Khartoum is, the capital is, all the way up to the north, that part became very, very developed. The southern part of Sudan, unfortunately, which is now South Sudan, did not receive that same kind of development and that same kind of attention. So you have this issue of development that is now underlying these tribal issues that is now on top of this government that wants to purely identify as Arab and as nothing else other than that. And all of these just create the perfect storm for the conflict that we saw and that unfortunately caused our country to divide into two separate nations.
Okay. And you may not remember it, or if you have any insight on, that's fine. The accusations of slavery, where that was one of the driving forces back in the 90s and early 2000s with that war, was the accusations and the stories of Arabs in the north enslaving Black Africans in the South. I know I'm using those terms very, very loosely. So
Yeah.
like everybody's really Black. But was that true? Were there any instances of that? Well, obviously people may have been kidnapped. Obviously, people may have been
Yeah.
kidnapped and put into POW camps and had forced labor and stuff like that. That happens almost all wars. But was slavery used as a weapon, as far as you're aware?
As far as I'm aware, I don't remember that just because I was born in the like 93, so
Right.
I was still relatively young when this was happening. So to my knowledge, I actually don't know or I don't have information about that. So I don't want to comment and say something that I'm not aware of or that I don't have information to be able to back up, unfortunately. So
Okay.
the short answer to that is I unfortunately don't know. I apologize.
No problem. No problem. Now, unfortunately, not too long after that conflict ended, actually, while the conflict ended up leaving 2011, and with the split up of Sudan, South Sudan. But even before that, while that was still going on, and by the way, I just want to let our listeners know during that period, American evangelists and evangelicals were pumping that story so much. That's why I knew it was a distorted story.
Hmm.
I was in college or high school. Well, high school, then on into college when it was really in the news, and the internet was not as big as it is right now. We had internet, but it was mostly text based. It wasn't, YouTube and everything like that. So what we heard about was usually these horrific stories, and those, of course, print media like magazines and stuff like that really pushed the same narrative. But the main thing is that there's a lot of money was pumped into a lot of money we used to buy weapons was pumped into the South Sudanese as they were labeled as predominantly Christian and Black. And so that naturally pulled on the heartstrings of Americans in general, but also Black Americans as well. A lot of my fellow tribes, I suppose, fell for that story. Again, it's hard for me to say that I wasn't there. It's hard for me to say that no slavery happened, but again, forced labor, kidnapping, POWs is unfortunately a part of war, and so
Absolutely.
that may have happened. But I don't know if it was like you. I don't know. I can't verify. I will not trust the evangelicals one way or the other. They say that Muslims are using slavery as a form of war, as a weapon of war. So I wouldn't believe it either. But I just want to let people know that American evangelicals were heavily involved in pumping that story and pumping money into South Sudan, which allowed them to resist the government for so long and eventually break away.
I do want to mention one thing about that also.
Mhm.
Actually, South Sudan has most of Sudan's oil. A lot of people don't know that. So 80% of the oil that exists in Sudan, when it was Sudan as a combined North and South Sudan, existed in South Sudan. And so one of the problems was that in order to get the oil from the South, you have to go through the North. And so one of the things that now happened when the country split is that you can just do direct trade with South Sudan instead of having to do it with the North. And that was one of the assets and one of the benefits that a lot of countries got as a result of that split. So I can totally see and understand why evangelicals would have, pushed the story. And I can, the idea of resources, especially something as petroleum and oil sitting in the South and the South Sudan being like basically an oil field. I can definitely understand why that story would have been pushed so heavily and what the benefit for people is, or the benefit for countries is from having Sudan split.
Yeah, there's always oil drives so much back in that part of the world.
Yeah,
So
subhanallah.
now the next thing that happened was Darfur, and a lot of people we haven't heard that word in a long time, but I remember in the
Hmm.
early 2000, 2003, 4, 5, around that time, maybe even as late as 2006, there's a war in Darfur, and this time it was different in the fact that both sides were Muslim. And but of course, when they show the Darfuris are not, I think Darfuris is the proper term for them. When they
Hmm.
show the Darfuris, they were Muslim, but I don't know how to put it, but they look more African. It's so simple. I don't know how to put it. They were obviously Muslim based on the way they dressed and based upon their customs. You could tell that they were Muslim, but they were also um, they didn't look like they had much Arab background in them or Turkish or anything like that. It looked like they were more African. And
Yeah.
I remember we had a lot of George Clooney. We had a lot of celebrities getting involved in it, and I mean George Clooney, who I think his mother father were part of the CIA anyway,
Hmm.
worked for the CIA. So there's always that part of it. But also it's just that that was the next thing that made a big splash in Western media. And once again, even though both sides were Muslim, it made it appear as if it was, once again, Arabs versus black. It didn't receive as much attention for as long. The evangelicals were not willing to give a bunch of black Muslims all that money and weapons, but they still used the media to demonize Sudan. Now, as far as you were a little bit older by then, you may have still been maybe just a teenager at that point in time.
Hmm.
Yeah, or maybe even a preteen. First, as far as you are aware, was that once again Arab versus black, considering that both sides were Muslim at this time around.
Sorry, could you repeat that question for me?
Once again, as it was portrayed in the Western media, it looked as Arabs versus black. Only this time, Arab Muslims versus African or black Muslims. Once again, was that a tribal thing, or was there? What was the? As far as you are aware, what was the genesis or the cause behind that conflict in Darfur in the early 2000s?
Yeah. So to my knowledge, the issue, and this is speaking to a bunch of people from Darfur, the issue was actually an issue of cattle grazing. Um, so in Darfur, the land is very rich in like it's a very like pasture rich land, right? And so because it's a very pasture rich land, you have a lot of nomadic tribes just kind of taking their cattle and grazing. There's no demarcation of property per se, right? And so you have people who will graze on other people's lands, and this obviously causes a problem in the long run. A lot of people probably don't think of this as an issue, but if I have a bunch of cows that I need to graze and I'm getting, milk from these cows and I'm selling the milk and, the cows, I'm maybe slaughtering them and selling the meat, it causes a problem for me, right? If other people are now coming and grazing their cattle on whatever land I'm on at the moment. So that actually causes a bunch of tribal conflicts. The tribal conflicts then get escalated when the government up in the north says, why don't we just give one of these sides some weapons? And then this actually is what causes the issue and what escalates the issue initially. After that, it then becomes a group of people who actually are fighting for their rights and fighting for the ability to have a say in government, because there was some, there were parts of the government that were like, we should not let these people be in the government. They should not have a say in the government. We're a purely we're a purely Arab nation. We identify as Arab. We have the Pan Arab flag, which is the flag that we currently use. A lot of people don't know actually this flag was changed actually in right after 1956 that after Sudanese independence that flag was changed to the Pan Arab flag. So we have these conflicts again going on. It's a perfect snowstorm. The government's like, okay, let's make this happen again. You know, like we are going to be a Arab nation. That's what's going to happen.
Okay. How did that do you know how that conflict ended ultimately, or ultimately got resolved, or is it still going on just on the media? Do you know what happened with that one? I haven't. It's just like dropped out of the news
Uh,
cycle after a while. I don't even know how it was resolved.
yeah. So initially the leader of the rebel forces from Darfur, his name was John Garang actually. So he ended up becoming vice president of Sudan, the Republic of Sudan as vice president. And what happened was he was assassinated. And this was several years later. Yeah, he was assassinated several years later while he was on a helicopter. And actually, he made a very poignant speech, which was that, you know, even though we may come from different tribes, and again, we have a lot of tribal issues in Sudan as well. Even though we come from different tribes, we come from, you know, different we have different languages. Each tribe has its own language. We come from different tribes. We come from different backgrounds. We are still Sudanese, and that's the thing that ties us together, right? Like this is still the land that we're born on, and we're still Sudanese, and that's what keeps us together. Which was a very, very beautiful speech. And unfortunately, looking back on it now, I wish people would have actually heeded his words more, because then we wouldn't have had the split into South Sudan, and we wouldn't have had, you know, everything that occurred. At the end of the day, though, you know, when you are oppressed for so long, when you feel like you don't have a say in the government, when you feel like your skin color or the tribe that you belong to has definitely affected your ability to thrive, I don't blame people for wanting self-determination and for wanting to split away and for wanting their own nation. That's not something I can fault my brothers from South Sudan for, my sisters from South Sudan for, especially given, you know, that they were looked at very weirdly and that they were ostracized in society. And so I completely understand that. The Darfur issue still continued, and it continued actually with what we're going to talk about with this current conflict.
Okay.
And this current conflict actually leads back into that one.
Okay. Was the original conflict, well, it may not have been the original one, but the civil war that led to the splitting of South Sudan and regular Sudan, was that connected in any way to Darfur either, or were they just, besides the government being involved in both of them, obviously, were they connected as far as you're aware of?
Um, there's a lot of socio-political issues that existed there. Again, you know, people from the South not having a say in the government,
Yeah.
being mistreated in terms of citizenship. So the hierarchy in Sudan is if you consider yourself Sudanese Arab, you're at the top. You know, that would be the equivalent of like, you know, being quote unquote white here in the US, right? And then after that, everybody else kind of falls after that, which is why, as I mentioned earlier, people will say like, oh, I'm Sudanese Arab, or I'm Sudanese Turkish, or I'm Sudanese XYZ. So unfortunately, the further down you go, the less kind of rights you have. It's not really a caste system, because I realize that describes like a caste system. It's not really like a set caste system, like you would see in like India or, you know, in the subcontinent. It doesn't exist like that, but it's definitely based on your phenotype, definitely based on the way that you look, definitely based on where you come from within the country itself. And so there's a lot of like issues that exist like that. And as far as I know, the way that it split was that, you know, just people got tired of being second class citizens in their own country, you know, and they said we want our own nation, and you know, we come from this particular region, so let's split.
Okay. All right. Is there, you mentioned tribalism. Are there also tribes within the Arab Sudanese or Sudanese Arabs? Or I guess they also have their own tribes and factions as well. Is there any specific one that has controlled the government more than any others, such as I think in Afghanistan they have the Pashtun who generally control the government most of the time, and even within that, a certain section of the Pashtun. But different nations. But I'm just that's the thing. Is there any? I think Ethiopia has been dealing with a similar
With
tribal
the Oromo
conflict.
people.
Yeah, yeah, where
Yeah.
a certain group of people have pretty much controlled the nation, and but it's the same thing in Sudan, where even amongst or even within the Sudanese Arabs, there is a hierarchy or one group that has controlled the government more or has more control over the government and its gears, so to speak.
Yeah, that I wouldn't have the answer to. I would just say that the for most of my adult life, so I'm now 30 years old. most of my adult life, it's just been the military, you know? And so the military has pushed that pan-Arab view. So I don't have, and I come from a different tribe, so I'm Nubian. So I don't really have, we're actually treated as second-class citizens and third-class citizens in the country as well. So I wouldn't really know too much about which Arab tribe actually would own or hold the government and have control of the government. I would just know it completely as the military because for my most of my adult life, that's what it's been. The military has been the one that's controlling the government.
Okay. So now you sparked my curiosity. You referred to yourself as Nubian. Now that's often thrown around here in the United States among Black people, so conscious Black folks or Afrocentric Black people. We often throw that around. It generally just means African, but from East Africa, sort of. We know that it's like Egypt or Southern Egypt and all. From your point of view, what is Nubian? If you want to explain that as best as you can, what is exactly what does it mean to be Nubian? Is that a
Yeah.
tribe, an ethnic group, or what exactly is it?
So it's both a tribe and an ethnic group. We are the people of Kush, the kingdom of Kush.
Mhm.
So this would be Nubia would be what is southern Egypt, northern Sudan today. So from the city of Aswan in Egypt, further down into I guess Wadi Halfa in Sudan, which is the border between Egypt and Sudan. We used to live there. In 1956, the Aswan High Dam was built, and it flooded actually our villages. What happened was our government actually made a bunch of different treaties. One with Egypt that said, Egypt builds this dam, they get hydroelectricity to Egypt, and Sudan would get some cut of the money, but the people would essentially end up losing out on both of this, the Nubians. So once they built the dam flooded villages, and there was like a really big UN project to try to save some of the monuments that existed in that region. So people ended up having to go. Some people had to move up into Egypt, and some people had to move further down into Sudan. We were actually forced relocated again. And so once we were forced relocated, we moved further down into Sudan. The government moved us further down into Sudan. And this goes back into like the Pan-Arab government because we have our own language, we have our own dialect, we have our own history. We had like government officials who would come on TV and say, I want to wake up and never hear this language ever again, you know? And so they would do these things. They would put
Talking about the
cyanide
Nubian
in
language, right?
the Nubian language, yeah.
Okay.
They would put cyanide in the water because some people refused to move down because we lived by the Nile and the Nile was so important to us. We would put cyanide in the water, put people in mass graves, and like there's just a very, very long history that exists with that. But that's typically who we are as Nubians. We still have our language today. My generation would have been the last to speak it had there not been like efforts to revitalize the language, the culture, and the heritage. So that's who we are as Nubians.
I never. That's interesting. I never realized that. I never knew that. And I
Yeah.
could have a million questions on the history of Nubia, but now, if you know, and this is those people, YouTube comments can be kind of stupid. So you're going to get people saying all sorts of crazy things. Were the Nubians conquered by Arabs and forced to convert to Islam, as far as you are aware of?
No,
Just want to
actually.
clarify
So
that.
as far as I'm aware of, no, actually, when the Adabs entered Sudan, they actually couldn't enter into like what would be considered Nubia. And
Mhm.
there's actually a bunch of Sahabas who talk about this, and they say that like when we tried to enter into Nubia, we met an army of archers, the greatest archers that we had seen, and they plucked out the eyes of 162 Sahabis, if I was correct, if I remember the story correctly, just through archery, and so they couldn't enter into Sudan, so they had to go back and figure out another way to come in. And eventually there was a treaty that was written with one of the Nubian kings, and he told them, okay, as Arabs, you can enter into Sudan, but you have to not live in permanent buildings. You have to live in huts so that whenever we want to kick you out, we can just burn your huts and kick you out of the country. And so that's how it happened. Eventually, obviously, we accepted Islam because it made sense to us. As ancient people, to make it easier for people to understand what a Nubian is, what you consider ancient Egyptian history is actually Nubian history. It's stolen history.
Mhm.
That's what it is. So whenever you think about ancient Egypt, what you're actually thinking about is Nubia. So as if you are familiar with ancient Egyptian history, you'll know that over time they did kind of begin to become monotheistic in a way. And
Yeah.
so it became easier at some point or another for us just to be like, okay, this makes sense. Islam makes sense. We're accepting Islam. Boom. And that's how it happened.
Okay. All right. Was that area was ever part of the either Umayyad Khilafat? It seems like it would have been. I'm not certain. Do you know if it was part of the Umayyad Khilafat at that time?
Part of the
Umayyad was I won't say. Well, you said it wasn't really conquered. Did they? Was it like a vassal, or was it part of the Umayyad? After the Umayyad, well, really, Egypt was conquered during the reign of Umar bin Khattab.
Yep.
But They eventually became part of the Umayyad dynasty, Umayyad Caliphate. Was Nubia part of that, or do you know if it was like an independent state, or if you don't know,
It,
it's fine. I'm just curious.
um,
Remember,
I
I'm
know.
going to ask these questions sometimes.
Yeah, no worries. I know it was an independent state for a very long time, but then I know that it fell actually during the Aksum Empire. The Aksum Empire from
Mm-hmm.
Ethiopia destroyed Nubia. That I know, but I don't know if it ever became part of the Umayyads off the top of my head. Actually, there is
Okay.
also one thing I would do want to mention because we are talking about Islamic history. Um, a lot of historians actually have said that, the Habasha, the Abyssinia that they're referring to is actually the Sudan, the Nubia that they were
Mm,
actually talking about, and that
okay.
that region, when they say Abyssinia, is not the present day Ethiopia that people are referring to. It's actually
Yeah.
Nubia.
Yeah.
Wallahu a'lam. That I'm not, I haven't been able to verify that 100%, but that's what we're told.
Okay. Yeah. I believe the king, An-Najashi, I think he was actually the king of the Aksum Empire, Aksum Kingdom, as you mentioned. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I'll have to go back and get my details for that. I see what you mean. I do know it wasn't part of the modern state of Ethiopia. It's
Hmm.
just that I think the old name of modern state of Ethiopia was Abyssinia, and so somehow the terms are roughly in the same area, so the terms got kind of crossed. But yeah,
Yeah.
I got what you mean. Okay, now for the current conflict.
Sure.
Um, the current conflict, the first, this is my perspective. Okay, I remember a couple of years ago, even seeing I follow you on Instagram. I saw it on your on your profile as well. Sudanese were celebrating after a long, um, I guess, mostly peaceful struggle, peaceful demonstrations, mostly marching in the streets, protests, and stuff like that. There's a lot of celebration with the overthrow of whoever was. I just don't know who it was. Somebody's last name was Bashir. The
Bashir. Yep.
overthrow of the president or the leader or the ruler of Sudan, his overthrow and the coming of a more fair and just government. Of course, the media portrayed it as democracy. I don't know if that was necessarily what people wanted, but whatever the case may be, they had gotten rid of the guy without who was there in charge, without a whole lot of killing and bloodshed. I'm sure there was some, but most strong men do whatever they can to stay in power.
Hmm.
But it wasn't, the horrible two sides of civil war that we can see we are seeing now. Then all of a sudden, I'm thinking, okay, well, Sudan's on the up and up now. The next thing I know, and it's unfortunate around the same time, at least it hit my mind, and I might just be conflicting things or conflating things. But the next thing I know, it's a civil war going on, it's fighting, and it's going around the same time as the situation in Gaza, and it's just, I'm like, what happened? It was just everything was going so great not too long ago. At least that's how it seemed to be.
Hmm.
Take us back, if you can, to the beginning, or at least to the protest. What sparked the protest? Who was this Bashir guy? And what happened after that, after they finally toppled him?
Yeah. So, okay. The Bashir regime actually starts 30 years ago. So right before I was born.
Okay.
Um,
Wow, is that long?
Sudan has a history of military coups and continuing military coups. So Bashir, right before I was born, overthrows the government at the time. He and a bunch of co-conspirators, one of them, Bashir is the military figure. So you have a military figure. And
What's his
obviously,
full name? I say Bashir. I'm sorry,
Omar
Mr. What is this?
al-Bashir,
What is it again?
Omar al-Bashir.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Go ahead. Continue.
no worries. By all accounts, he's not very intelligent. So he's not the mastermind behind this coup. The mastermind behind this coup is a guy by the name of Hassan al-Turabi. And Hassan al-Turabi is this guy who studies in France, who, speaks French, English, speaks a bunch of different languages, and is an intellectual. He has some very deviant beliefs, in terms of Islam, but is an intellectual by all accounts. He's the one who masterminds this coup and then puts Umar al-Bashir as the figurehead, who is to rule the government for the next 30 years. They start this party now, and this party is essentially the one who holds power for 30 years, and it's the government party. What they do is they basically assassinate anybody who tries to force a coup d'etat, because again, we have a long history of coups in Sudan, and this is how the military continues to hold power. Now fast forward to 2019, so right prior to COVID. what ends up happening is the Sudanese people are sick. Sudan is known as the breadbasket of Africa. We have 12 rivers that run through Sudan. If we wanted to take over the world with just our cows, we could. We have 4 to 6 cows for every single human being in Sudan, and there's 48 million of us. So if we wanted to wage a war with just cows on the world, we could, and we would be pretty successful at it. So we are the third largest producer of gold in Africa. In terms of landmass, Sudan is or was the second largest country in terms of landmass. It has rich pastures in Sudan. Like people used to say, actually, and people from outside of Sudan, if you spit in Sudan, wherever it is that you spit would grow because of how rich and fertile the soil is. Meaning the moisture from your mouth would cause like grass to just grow because of how fertile it is. So 12 rivers, second largest producer of gold. We have a lot of petroleum in Sudan, as I mentioned earlier. So it's a very, very rich country. Um, Given all of this, the people are not getting any of the riches, right? They're not getting any of the riches that are coming into the country. The government is pocketing money. They're selling land to foreign governments and pocketing it. At some point or another, there was a deal that was made with the African Union where Sudan was to receive, I think, like 600 million USD for infrastructure within the country itself. And the 600 million just goes missing. Nobody knows where it went, which is insane, you know? So we have this happening for a very long time, and we get to the point where people who have PhDs in Sudan and people who are college graduates are not able to find your basic jobs. They can't even like find jobs that, we would think of as teenager jobs here, where you're throwing like newspapers or you're flipping burgers, whatever it is. And there's nothing wrong with those jobs, but they can't even find jobs that they can work to sustain themselves. And so that plus the corruption, the inflation, people just get very upset and they start taking to the streets. They take to the streets, and this begins in December. So they go to the streets all the way up until, if I remember correctly, June 3rd. And June 3rd begins is a very like this is during Ramadan. June 3rd is a very, very important day in Sudanese history because a bunch of people were at the military headquarters. They had a sit-in. So the people protesting had a sit-in at the military headquarters. And
You
the
say June 3rd, June 3rd, 2020 now, or 2021?
June, so this is June 3rd, 2020, if I remember correctly.
Okay, all
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, this
Okay,
is June 3rd, 2020, or June 3rd, 2019. I may be mixing up the dates because I don't
okay.
remember exactly which. But people are now sitting at the military headquarters, and the military orders the forceful dispersal of the people by weapons. So they actually shoot people. And this is the day before
These
Eid.
are protesters that they're shooting, right?
Huh?
These are the protesters, the demonstrators that they're shooting?
Yeah, they're shooting the demonstrators and the
Okay.
protesters, and people are just like hanging out and they're just sitting there, feeding each other and doing all these things. And this actually ends up being the day before the end Eid al-Fitr. So it becomes a very, very sad day for us because we're like, oh, like this is happening. And it actually becomes a pretty bloody situation where people's bodies are now thrown into the Nile and like, people are being found decapitated and things of this nature. It's a very gruesome thing. And I apologize to the viewers for that one, but it's a very, and this is something that we don't see
No.
again. And we don't see this, and it's so shocking to us because we're actually not a very violent society. Despite the violence that our government has enacted upon itself and the fighting, we're not a violent society, right? We are very hospitable, generous, kind people. So this ends up happening, and this is kind of like the second point at which we're like, okay, this has to, like, the government has to fall. We continue going up until actually this is December. Sorry, all of this starts in 2018. I apologize. 2018 because August 4th, 2019 is when Bashir actually gets overthrown. That's when that happens.
Okay.
That's when that happens. So this is 2018 going into 2019, so right before COVID. And eventually Bashir steps down and a government is put together, a transitional government is put together, which co is comprised of parts of the military, because the military says we're not going to give away power immediately, and democratically elected leaders. And the agreement that's made is a transitional government would be made, and this transitional government would basically hold power for about 39 months and then would transition fully to a fully democratic government elected by the people for the people. That leads into the conflict here today because the way that the transitional government is formed, you have two heads of them. You have the head from the democratic civilian side and the head from the military side. The head from the military side is actually Al-Burhan, who is Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who is one of the generals fighting in the war currently. And then the other side is the Prime Minister Hamdok, who was the first democratically elected prime minister in 30 years in all of Sudan. Um, we reach a point where they are kind of trying to find a balance and trying to work together. The military is always looking to squash any type of movements that the civilian side is making. And eventually it results in the military actually imprisoning Hamdok in his house, telling him he can't leave, and beginning to imprison and release members of the ruling party that had ruled the military for 30 years. Their ruling party members, releasing them from prison and doing all these things. Then the transitional government gets dissolved. The military dissolves the transitional government and says, JK, we're actually not going to hand this over. Like, this is not how that's going to go at all. And they take power. The chairman from the military side is a guy by the name of Hamdan Daglo, who is Hemeti, which is the other side that's now fighting Burhan. So the military council is comprised of, again, the transitional government is comprised again of your civilian side, led by Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok, and then you have your military side, which is led by General Burhan. The military side has a vice deputy who is Hemeti. And the reason why I said we'll come back to this earlier is because Hemeti was the guy. So the rapid support forces that we know today is actually the Janjaweed that was causing all the problems in Darfur back during the
Oh,
Darfur
okay. I meant to ask you
situation.
about the Janjaweed, but it slipped my mind. Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
they rebranded. The Janjaweed was a paramilitary force that was put together by the Sudanese armed forces, and they basically were let free to do what they wanted to do in Darfur, and they were the ones who were terrorizing the Darfuris and doing all these things on behalf of the government.
Mm.
So now you have this paramilitary force that is now called the Rapid Support Forces, and the leader of the Rapid Support Forces is now the vice deputy of this transitional government from the military side. Eventually, as I mentioned, Burhan says, JK, we're not going to hand over power. And then he holds on to power, and they actually now begin fighting the vice deputy, who is Hemeti, and Burhan, who is the leader of the Sudanese armed forces, which is our actual military, and the
Okay.
paramilitary force begins fighting. And that's how we get to where we are today.
So you have if I understand correctly, the Janjaweed rebranded as the Rapid Security Force, Rapid Attack Force,
Rapid Support Forces,
Rapid Support Force,
the RSF. Yep.
and but they still, even though they were military, they were still led by Hemeti, I guess. He was the leader of the Rapid Support Forces. So separate
Hmm.
from the regular Sudanese army, which already had a history of coups anyway. So and
Yep.
so after the protest and I guess Bashir stepped down, you have the government represented by the two military forces, the army and the Rapid Security Force, I understand correctly. On the
Support
other
forces.
side, you
Yep.
have the prime minister who was elected by the people. You have those two, and he represents the protesters, and I guess all the other groups may
Hmm.
have been part of that. And the agreement was we're going to split the government, share government power. But eventually, the military said, "No, we'll keep this all for ourselves." Put the prime minister on the house arrest. So I'm understand correctly. Is he still alive? By the way, they haven't.
Yeah, he's still alive. He's
Okay.
still alive. Yep. But he's out of the
Okay.
country. He's been kicked out.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
he's out.
Okay. I'm
Yeah.
sorry to put him in exile. A lot of times it was doing so well for these guys. So,
Yeah.
um, okay. Okay. So now Hemeti and Bordehan, that's the guy who's in charge of the main army, the real army, right?
Him,
Bordehan,
Burhan.
Bordehan
Yep.
is in charge of the regular Sudanese army.
Yep.
Hemeti. So now these two are they the ones who are fighting each other now for
Yep.
control?
Yeah.
Okay.
S-
Okay.
Yeah. So they're the ones fighting each other now for control. Abdel Fattah, Burhan, and Mohammed Hamdan Daglo are the two that are fighting each other. So you have the actual Sudanese armed forces, which is the SAF, that's the actual government of the actual military of Sudan,
Right.
versus the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, aka the Janjaweed, which is the paramilitary force that it created. So they
Gotcha.
basically created a monster that is now coming to bite the hands that feeds it.
Oh boy. All right. So now here's the question that I've heard people say that the United States is behind some of this, and also the UAE. I was surprised if I mean people. For sometimes it is true. Many times it is true. People accuse the United States of being behind a lot of these conflicts that happen around the world. Many times it's true. So I'm not going to say it's not true, but sometimes I think things are just sometimes overblown. Is the United States, as far as you are aware, is the United States either directly or indirectly causing the conflict or causing the fighting between Hemeti and Burhan, that is the Rapid Security Force and Sudanese Army, or are they supporting one side against the other, or who knows? Do you know if the United States is involved in any way? Just the United States for now.
Yeah. So I'm going to answer this question a little bit indirectly because there's a bunch of players that are in Sudan. So Sudan has become a battlefield for a bunch of different players and proxy wars. So once the Rapid Support Forces formed their own paramilitary and once they grew, um, it they're actually supported by a bunch of different people, including the UAE, right? So the UAE supports the Rapid Support Forces, and they were actually also being supported by Russia for a very long time. Why is
I
that?
expected that one.
Because, yeah, why is that? So actually, when the U.S. sanctioned Russia for its attack on the Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine, Russia was sanctioned, and the thing that was keeping Russia going was Sudanese gold. So they were using the gold. The leader of the Rapid Support Forces, he and his family have taken over a gold mine in Sudan, and they are exporting this gold, which they're selling to Russia, and Russia is then using to continue its economy and do whatever the business that it does. They also receive military weapons from the UAE, and the military weapons from the UAE are what is allowing the Rapid Support Forces to fight the Sudanese armed forces. Now, on the other side, you also have the Sudanese government, which is supported by a bunch of different powers in the area as well. One of those powers includes Egypt. You also have now recently the Sudanese armed forces being supported by the Russians. So they switch sides. The Russians switched sides because they began to see that the RSF was actually losing. So they decided for their own stability and for Russia's own stability that it would be better to support the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF. So a bunch of different players, and then obviously you have the U.S. who supports the UAE as an ally and gives funding to the UAE, weapons and things like that, which then make their way to Sudan. And then you also have the Israelis as well, which have a big play in this too. So some of the weaponry that the RSF has actually is smuggled in that way as well and has been found to have origins in Israel.
Okay, so now that does make sense now that with Russia in the mix and Russia backing the SAF, Sudanese
Mhm.
Armed Forces, the United States would almost certainly support the other side, the Rapid Security Forces, the former Janjaweed. Crazy how that turns out because 20 years ago, they were the Janjaweed were the boogeyman. And now they're
Yeah.
the U.S. proxies. Okay. And because the UAE is a U.S. ally, and UAE probably, I'm almost certain they get a lot of weapons from the United States anyway. And
Mhm.
so they're backing the Rapid Security Forces. Okay, so basically, unfortunately, Sudan has become like Vietnam and Korea and many other nations around the world that are proxies between the United States and Russia at some point in
Yep.
time. Okay, that that helps clear up a lot of things. Are there those are the two main factions? Are there any other groups involved right now besides those two sides? RSF and the SAF.
AF. Yeah. It's the acronyms are a little confusing and they get like it's very easy to jumble them up. But for the most part, those are the two main warring factions at the moment. Obviously you have, people who say, for example, that the RSF is comprised of forces that are, of people who are from Mauritania and from Chad and from all these neighboring countries. I don't know how true that is. I can't verify that 100% and, say that that's 100% correct. Allahu A'lam, yeah, that's not my place to say. But what we do know for sure is that those are the two warring factions, and those are the powers that be behind those two warring factions at the moment.
Okay, is there any sort of now? Of course, many civilians are being harmed and killed as well. Is it that the civilians are being killed in crossfire or in the fighting? Like if the two armies or two sides happen to clash within the village, the people living there would be would be among the casualties, or is it any direct attack against civilians where okay, you support this side, so we're going to wipe out your village, things like that. As far as you are
Yeah.
aware, how are civilians getting killed in something that really is two sides of the military fighting each other?
Yeah. So when we say that these are two sides of the military. I want to be very careful. And the reason why I want to be very careful is because initially you have people who are like, there's a lot more that's going on behind this crisis than is just two sides fighting. One of them is demographic change that's wanting to occur in Sudan. So, for example, the RSF is a very pro-Arab force, right? So they are fighting and they are destroying anybody who is not Arab. If you do not belong to a quote unquote Arab tribe in Sudan, you are going to be like your property is going to be annihilated. In Khartoum, what they have done is they would go into a house, for example, put a gun to somebody's head and say, leave now and don't ever come back. This is now ours. And so they are taking things like that. They would go into houses and like loot them and take the property. You have videos of RSF leaders saying and telling their soldiers, if you find an empty building that's still standing, claim it as your own. It's yours now, and things like this. Conversely, you have the military who is using jet fighter planes, for example, to drop bombs. And so as you're dropping bombs, obviously, you're not really taking into consideration, who is in the area. You're just dropping a bomb on the building. So civilians are getting caught that way. Civilians are also being actively harmed. Rape, unfortunately, is being used as a weapon against women, for example, who are going to go try to buy resources, astaghfirullah, like I hate to have to explain this, but unfortunately, you want to buy, stuff for your family, then you have to engage in certain acts and I will give you money or give you those things in return. So these are things that are happening in places in other regions of Sudan, not just Khartoum, but in other regions as well. And these are being used as tactics of war as well. We're hearing about sexually transmitted diseases being spread all over Sudan as a result of these things. People becoming pregnant in Sudan. Like it's not just two militaries or two powers duking it out. The civilians are also very much so casualties of this war, and they have nothing to do with it. It's just two greedy people vying for power to control Sudan. And the joke now is like, what are you controlling? There's nobody there. Khartoum is emptied out. There's nobody in Khartoum. There's nothing in Khartoum. It's not even building standing anymore. They burnt the how when you come into New York City, you kind of see the New York skyline is a very like it's a everybody who see the skyline knows this is New York. We have buildings like that in Sudan that are now burnt to the ground, for what purpose? Just to destroy. So like the joke now is like, okay, what are you ruling over? You're ruling over nothing. The people have left the country is no more. You've destroyed it. So civilians are not just caught in the crossfire in that manner, but they're also being actively targeted as well by both sides.
Do you know if there are any? I know I'm sure that there have always been discussions or peace talks or at least mention of ceasefires behind the scenes. Right now, as it stands right now in mid-October 2024, are you aware of any movement towards peace, or does peace seem likely by the end of the year or within the next 6 months or so? How do you see the current situation right now?
So the tides have been turning in Sudan. Initially, what was going on since this conflict started was that the RSF was actually controlling a lot of Sudan and taking a stronghold in a lot of the places. But the military, which is the SAF now, the Sudanese Armed Forces, have been able to push them out of certain areas and have been able to, keep them out of certain areas and remove them from certain areas. So I'm not sure if that does mean that there is going to be an end to the war, Allah ya'lam. But what I do know is that, it doesn't really matter which side wins because the people are going to lose in the end. And what I do want to mention, I think is important is that, we have a lot of people who are supporting the SAF. And this is where like the conversation of the lesser of the two evils comes in. I don't really, the SAF is the same entity that brought about the RSF and that has brought about the situation. If you think about it, you were the ones in power for 30 years and you are the ones who caused you you imprisoned the first democratically elected leader, you dissolved the Transitional Military Council, which you agreed to. You created the RSF. The RSF came back and bit you in the hand. Now you have to fight this thing that you created and you want people to praise you for it. No, you don't get the praise for that. You're fixing a problem that you created, but you are the one who created this problem in the beginning. So what and this is not just for the Sudanese people out there who are going to listen to this. This is for everybody. What we don't want is to go back to the government ruling, because what it's looking like right now, and what the media machine is doing right now, is making the military look like the hero. But they're not the hero because they're fixing a problem that they created, you know? And so we're hearing a lot of people go, yeah, we're ready to go back to when the government ruled the country. That's not the answer, that's not the solution. And I think that's super important to mention, because that's how we got here in the first place.
Right. That leads to another observation that often since the war in Gaza started, many people will try to deflect from Gaza and say, why is nobody talking about Sudan? So much is happening in Sudan. And this is my first time really getting a good understanding of what's happening. I can listen, I don't really care for Western media too much, but I know I'm getting it through a heavy filter. So hearing it straight from you is much more enlightening to me. But, one of the problems is that from a Muslim perspective, there's no good guy or bad guy. It's Muslims versus Muslims. Whereas in
Hmm.
Palestine, Gaza, we know who, from our perspective, is the bad guy and who's the good guy, who we're rooting for. But in Sudan, with this current conflict, at least, unless we're misunderstanding it, if we want to shed some light on that, I mean, who do we root for? Is there anyone that we can root for? Is it like what you said, is really just going to be a lesser of two evils, whoever comes out on top?
I think the who do we root for is the people, and I say this as somebody who organized protests in support of the revolution, who was out in the streets, and who has lost family members, and who's had family members imprisoned in Sudan because they are part of dismantling the old regime and things of that nature. I mention that, and I say that, as the people took to the streets, the people gave their lives for this. This is not for the military to come and swoop in and put on the cape and say, look, we saved the world. No. And this is not for the RSF to say, look, we're the good guys because the military ruled for 30 years. No, you were also part of that regime as well. This is where the people being able to pick for themselves who leads them is important. But I again don't want the people to just be brainwashed and have short-term memory and like amnesia and say, oh yeah, the military saved us from the RSF, so therefore we should vote for the military party again. That's not how it can't be that way.
Okay. Now, we're about out of time. We got a few more minutes here. Now, as I mentioned, Sudan hasn't gotten as much attention as Gaza. That's overshadowed pretty much everything the past year or so, a little bit more than a year now. Um, why do you think that is the case? There are the accusations of race and color being. I really don't think that's the case, at least not for us Muslims. Um, I think the situation in Sudan is a little more murky as I mentioned, you don't know who really to root for.
Mhm.
Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you think there is something more to. Why do you think it hasn't, just within the Muslim community, the American Muslim community, why do you think this conflict in Sudan has not received as much attention, as much, um, you know, sunlight as the situation in Gaza?
I think one of the things that's super important to remember is that, the situation in Gaza is part of, it's again an occupying force, so it's very different. The narrative is different, right? It's a very different narrative. When we think about Sudan, an African country, and we think about conflict, it unfortunately, the way we have heard about it and the way that we understand African conflicts is just another regular, just another thing. It's just another African country going through the same situations. This is a regular for them. However, as Muslims, our creed is depends on Gaza. Gaza is very vital to our creed, and Palestine is very vital to our creed. And so that is something that we also like. That adds to it. That's a layer to it. Um, we are hearing about the atrocities being more documented potentially in Gaza. Maybe that's it. Um, uh, Maybe it's a more dire situation. Allahu alam, I'm not really sure about what it is exactly. I know that Sudan forces, currently what Sudan is experiencing is the biggest internal displacement in history. So we have about 14 million people have been displaced in Sudan. It's projected that about 28 million people in Sudan are going to starve within the next maybe month and a half, which is, again, if you remember, I told you Sudan's population is about 48 million people, give or take. So we're talking about 52% of the population, about give or take. But I think we as Sudanese maybe aren't doing enough of a good job of really telling the world about what's happening in Sudan. But at the same time, again, we're an ummah, and so when one part of the ummah aches, the whole ummah feels it. And unfortunately, like what's happening in Gaza is really really devastating and really really heart-wrenching, and it maybe requires more of our attention. I'm not sure, I do have, I have had people who, when I have spoken about this, tell me you are deflecting, you are taking away from Gaza, you are taking away from the situation in Palestine, which is a little bit, saddening to hear, because our situation is not as bad, but it's a pretty devastating situation as well. But I think there's a bunch of different things that are at play here. Maybe documentation, could be race, could be color. Allahu alam. I'm not too sure about that one.
Okay. Um, if you know anything right now, you can let us know. But if not, we can get it to me later. I'll put it in the description. You know, if any charities, trustworthy charities that we can. There's not really much we can do about Sudan. It's not like our government has indirect influence on it. Obviously, as a proxy, but it's not the same thing with Israel, where our government has. What I mean by that is the United States government. Our government doesn't have direct influence, as far as I'm aware, in Sudan. So the most we can really do, as Muslims, is do, of course, with them.
Yeah.
And if we have the means to support them, if you know of any charities that you'd like me to share, you can mention them now. If not, we can pass them on later on. I'll include them in the show notes and in the description, so people can support relief efforts in Sudan.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the organizations that is doing really great work and that I'm a part of is the Sudanese-American Physician Association. So SAPA, SAPA. If you are on Instagram and you just look up Sudanese-American physicians, you'll see exactly the page. SAPA, mashallah, has done an excellent job of providing and opening up maternity wards in different hospitals, treating people in different locations, and taking, current med students and residents in Sudan and training them to be able to deal with, life, um, it's very serious injuries and things of that nature. So Alhamdulillah, SAPA is something that I personally endorse. And as a member of SAPA myself, I would advocate for SAPA and tell people that SAPA is a trusted resource that they can turn to and that they can donate to. And SAPA is doing the great work in Sudan. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Yeah, we'll definitely include that link in the description on YouTube and the show notes for the audio podcast. Last thing, Mazin, if you could um, just order, you could just go and flip a switch and get things right in Sudan. What would be your preferred outcome for the current situation? If you could control things and you could just say, this is how things should be, inshallah, how would you want the things to turn out in Sudan? Of course, you want the violence to stop, but ultimately, even once the shooting stops, what would you like in Sudan?
If I could flip the switch, all of the current military leaders would be imprisoned. So Burhan would be in prison, Hamdan Daglo would be in prison. All resources and assets that were taken by the military would be taken away from them, and then we would figure out who these actually rightfully belong to, because the military did take away from people and say this belongs to so and so. That would be one thing. That's the first thing I can think of. Once take away the power from the military, from both sides of the military, then we can actually begin to figure out, what happens and how we move forward. The infrastructure is really something that needs to be rebuilt. I didn't mention this in the conversation, but actually, some people who study migration patterns have found that certain kinds of birds, have been changing their migration patterns because they're eating on corpses of people in Sudan that are out in the street, the civilians, dogs, same thing with the dogs. So one thing that if I could flip the switch really quickly again, RSF would be imprisoned, all of them. Burhan would be imprisoned, him and every single military official. We would get a brand new military for Sudan, one that understands that its job is just to protect the country. You are not politicians. You do not belong in politics. We would have a democratically elected government that would be going for the people, and everybody who lost and had to flee from Sudan would be back in Sudan in their homes with their rightful material properties.
No, I mean, may Allah make that happen, inshallah.
Amin, ya Rab. Amin. Amin.
All right, Brother Mazin, thank you very much, man. I cannot tell you how helpful this was for me. I'm sure many of the listeners will be grateful for giving us a better understanding of the conflict and the history of Sudan, helping us know what's going on much better. Is there any way, if you are okay with people reaching out to you or contacting you for more information, how can they reach out to you? Of course, I can put your Instagram link if that's okay with you. But if you have
Yeah, absolutely.
anything else you want to share, social media, email, whatever you want, you share it now if you like. And I will also include links to it as well.
Barakallah feek. Jazakallah kulli khair for giving me this opportunity. I really, really appreciate it. And this is another way for us to actually talk about what's going on in Sudan and better educate people. So Jazakallah kulli khair for that. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me on social media. So my Instagram will be somewhere in the comments or in the description. But for people who may not find it, it's at Bianchi. That's at Phiankhi. So you can find me there. Again, that's at Phiankhi. I'm on Twitter under that handle. You can feel free to shoot me an email, themazinkhalil@gmail.com. I'll be more than happy to respond to that. I may be a little late just because of med school kicking my butt, but inshallah, I will get to that when I get to it, biznillah. Barakallah feek.
Alhamdulillah, thank you very, very much. Now, hopefully, this conflict will end very, very soon. And when it does, you mind coming back on and giving us some understanding of the future of Sudan once the conflict will end eventually, inshallah. Are you okay with coming back
Inshallah.
on? I want to know. Okay, I have a feeling it's going to be a very popular episode. I thank you very much, Brother Mazin. Again,
Barakallah feek.
why, all right. I got into at some point in time. So as much as I would like to sit here and talk with you for another hour about Sudan and Sudanese history, we got to part ways. So once again, Alhamdulillah, thank you very much. May Allah bring peace and security and comfort to the people of Sudan and Gaza and Muslims all over the world.
Amin ya Rabb.
Brother Mazin, thank you very much, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah kulli khair. Thank you again.